for this week. I wanted to talk about a couple of things before we get into this week's lesson. And we're going to have an opportunity to start on one of this week's assignments in some small groups. That way I can pop in and help you with any questions you have about the stories for this week or the assignment itself. But I wanted to talk about attendance first. It's a big issue. I know that I sent out a message trying to clarify that last week. Attendance doesn't work the same way that it used to work. We can correct attendance. So that's why if you're marked absent in a class and you work on whatever the assignment is for attendance, then you'll stay absent until probably the next day. I correct my attendance the next day. I don't sit there at 11:55 waiting for everybody to turn in their formatives. I'll just look the next day and go back and change the attendance. When we were in our regular school situation, we couldn't change the attendance. So, the reality is that now we have to make sure that we can count as many students present as possible. So this week you have your formatives. There are 3 of them. There's one today, one on Thursday, and one on Friday because this is a B week. So there are 3. They open at 8 in the morning. So put it on your schedule. If you're having trouble organizing yourself, I highly recommend Google Calendar. Google Calendar will import all of your stuff, your assignments that are due from Google Classroom, and they'll also put in all of your links for all your Zoom meetings. I'll go to my calendar real quick so you can see it. So when you link up your Google Calendar with your classes, you can just click right from the calendar to enter your Zoom meetings. And for me, everything's all in one place. And I don't know, you might want to mess around with Google Calendar if you don't have something that works for you. I am grading formatives. So when you go to formative today, you'll see that I've been giving you points on your formatives, up to 5 points per question. I feel like if you're doing that work for attendance, it might as well, count in the gradebook. So the way that I'm going to be putting the formatives in the gradebook is twice a 6 weeks. The first time will be right at the end of the progress report period. So on that Friday, whenever we have to upload progress reports, I'll go to formative and I'll look and see what's your percentage on the formatives. 89, okay, I'm gonna put in an 89. Whatever your average is. That's gonna count as a minor grade at that point. Later on, at the end of the 6 weeks, I will go back to formative and I'll see, okay, what's the percentage now? And I'll put in that percentage for all of the formatives that whole 6 weeks, and that's going to be a major grade. I figure like it's a lot of work to do those formatives, and I'm not asking, dopey questions that are easy to respond to, so I'm going to make them count. And I think if you're going to spend time on them, they should count. So that's how the formatives are going to go into the grade book, if you have any questions about that. I'm also putting feedback. So when you go back to your formatives, you should see that I'm engaging with you about what you're writing about. Most of the time, there'll be a comment from me, I like this idea, or I'll ask you like a devil's advocate kind of question or whatever. We don't get a lot of engagement time, like, when we're in class. So I'm kind of using that to help with that. I also wanted to ask you about Google Classroom. It occurred to me this weekend that maybe some of you use Google Classroom to organize your to-do list. Most of our stuff is on Blackboard, but I do use Google Classroom as kind of like notifications and reminders kind of thing, stream. But if you want, I could put our assignments on there. You wouldn't turn them in there, but I'm trying to envision how it is for you. Do y'all go to your Google Classroom? And because a lot of your teachers use that, all the due dates are there. Would it be handy for me to put the due dates also on ours? What do y'all think?
I think that can help us a little bit more.
Okay. Because I feel like if that's your command central, like if that's your dashboard and you're going in every day and kind of looking to see what's due today, you wouldn't turn it in there. You just go and say done or something, right? I wouldn't make it where you had to turn something in, but then that way you can at least click it off like it's a do list kind of thing. John, want to let me know what you think? Yeah. Sean wants me to, but okay. I'll start doing, at least for Sean. If not, you can all ignore it, but I just feel like maybe maybe instead of every teacher having their own way and you have to go 9 different places, well, 8 different places to find all your stuff, if everything's kind of in Google Classroom, then you can kind of check off. I'll start doing that. All right, let's start in on today's material. Today you were supposed to read from the textbook on characterization and on setting. I want to take a few minutes to go through those chapters a little bit with you. I know you read them, but I feel like it's good to open it up for questions and to kind of highlight some main things. I like to go back over the material and add some other notes that you might want to add to help you. So let's start with character. We do have an assignment this week on character. So characterization is super important in literary study because we want to look at our characters and see what the authors are trying to represent with those characters and the messages that they're trying to send us. So, I mean, I think you all know what a character is. So the main thing here is probably to focus on some of the other terminology. So when we think of characters, we can think of round characters or flat characters, and they're defined here in your text. But I think the easiest way to think about them is to think about flat characters as two-dimensional, right? There's no depth to them. A message needed to be delivered, so there's a messenger. We don't know about that messenger's, personal life. We don't know their origin story. We don't know their hopes and dreams and motivations. A message just had to be delivered, and that guy came and left. Round character is more like a three-dimensional character, a character that we do know their thought process and their conflicts and what they're going through, and maybe, their issues and motivations. So you can kind of think of three-dimensional means we can see kind of like a lot of facets of that character, and flat two-dimensional just means they're just surface level. We don't know any depth to that character at all. They give some examples from the lottery. Maybe you read that in a previous class, and A and P in this chapter. But they also give some other examples. Foil character is something that you've probably been studying for a while. Sometimes people get this mixed up a little bit, but foil character is about a character that is similar in some ways and opposite in other characteristics. So say, for example, I had 2 characters who were sons, and the protagonist is a dutiful son who helps his family and saves money and does all those things that he's supposed to do. And the other son in the story is evil and cruel and doesn't help anybody. Well, they're both sons and they both have that role in the story. But when I compare them, I can see that son number 1 is super angelic compared to the other one. And so in contrast, this one seems all the better and this one seems all the worse. When I put this guy next to this guy, he looks horrible. And so the foil character is about contrast between characters. Stock characters, we sometimes call them archetypal characters, ARCHETYPAL, archetypal characters, or stock characters are the kinds that we see frequently in literature. They have a different name, they have a little different purpose, but there's always the mean mother-in-law, or the damsel in distress, or the clumsy neighbor. There's always those characters that pop up a lot, and those are usually flat characters because we don't really need any depth. We already know that guy from 50 other stories. So we call those stock characters. They show up a lot. And then caricatures are sort of characters that are their type, but they're extreme. So like if there's the kooky neighbor stereotype or stock character, if you have a caricature, then that character is like the ultimate extreme kooky neighbor. And the caricature almost gets, hilarious because of how over the top and extra they are in their qualities that are supposed to be there for their stock character. If you've ever seen a caricature drawing, usually certain features of the person are exaggerated. Like if the person has a fairly prominent nose, it'll be enormous in the picture. So those things get exaggerated. And we usually see those in comedies or, interestingly enough, ancient Greek drama, which we will be reading later in the semester. Okay, dynamic and static characters. So there's flat and round, and they're not the same thing as static and dynamic. Static and dynamic, you can almost think about it like science, right? Something that's static is not changing. It's in stasis. It's not moving, it's not improving or, degrading, it's just staying the same. So a static character doesn't change, doesn't make any determinations, doesn't have an epiphany, doesn't grow as a person. A dynamic character does. A dynamic character learns something, changes in some way, has a realization, and that's usually what the story's about. And that's usually the protagonist. So whatever the protagonist has to learn, has to grow through, has to become and change in order to actualize, that is usually the point of the story. So you can use that as a tool and look for that dynamic character and say, okay, what's that person going through? How do they come out at the end versus how they were at the beginning? And there's probably a message in there in the piece of literature. We give an example of Cinderella, but motivation, I think we all know what motivation is, what causes a character to act. And then at the end, here are some things that you would think about if you were analyzing character. So is there anything in the chapter that I can spend a little more time on for you? Okay. The other chapter that you needed to read for today and take some notes on was setting. So let me spend a little bit of time on that one too. As we go through the weeks, we're adding these different qualities so that by the time we finish with this study of short fiction, you should be able to look at all of these elements in a holistic way with the piece of short fiction. We will be writing a paper in this unit. It's not a research paper, it's an analysis paper. So you'll be looking at a news story and all these things will come into play in that paper. All right, so setting. I think everybody knows what setting is. There are some parts about setting though that we don't always consider. Usually we just look at time and place and we'll be like, oh, okay, Alabama 1950 and move on. But there are other elements to consider, and they talk in this chapter about historical elements, cultural elements, physical geography, all of those things. So when we talk about place, we think about place in time, we think about geographical location, all of those things. Is it in the woods? Is it in a house? What kind of house? Is it the 1950s or the 1590s, right? So all those things we have to think about. I think one of the key things that it's important to remember, and maybe put it, I don't think they talk about it in the chapter, but it's important to remember that we're not in 2020 most of the time when we're reading these pieces. And we have to, in a way, take our 2020 mindset and shut it off a little bit so that we can enter 1945, Louisiana, or, 1525 France. And we can't say when we're reading something, and this is where setting takes a center stage, we can't say, oh, that person's racist. Well, of course, it's 1860s on a cotton plantation. We can't judge people and characters and writers based on our time period. So when we look at a story like Battle Royal, which you should have read for today, Ralph Ellison was writing, and that story was published in the early 1950s, before the Civil Rights Movement. So the setting of that is important. We're living in 2020 in the era of, George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, all of those things, N-word, issues. And in that story, when it was written, those things hadn't come forward yet. So when we read that story, we can say, oh, they're racist, or, obviously they are in that story. But we have to remember to suspend our 2020 mind a little bit and just sort of leave it over here while we try to enter the mindset of the story, if that makes sense. And we have to kind of simultaneously envision the story, because there's no way Ralph Ellison could have known about Black Lives Matter in 2020 when he was writing in 1948, right? So it's just important to kind of remember that. We can still have our perspective today, but when we see, the N-word in texts and the way that sometimes women are treated in some stories, like the Yellow Wallpaper that you'll read for next week, we have to say, okay, well, that was that time period, and the way that we can't judge the characters necessarily with 2020 mindset. because they were a product of their time. Hopefully that makes sense. So setting is a part of that. They talk about historical settings, so that's where that enters the picture. There's politics that are going on in that time period. And this is where history kind of overlaps with literature. I think sometimes we go through our education and we say, oh, okay, well, history's that class over there and math's that class over there. And, you know, everything's got its own little spot. But a lot of our coursework really overlaps. And history and literature overlap a lot because writers are writing during their time period and creating characters that lived in different time periods. So we have to take that into consideration. Here we go. The next one is geography. Obviously, if it's something that's familiar to us, then we have an easier time of understanding the cultural norms of the location. But if we read a story that's translated from Norwegian about, you know, Norway in 1920, a lot of that terrain is going to be unfamiliar to us unless we have any Norwegians in the group. So we have to kind of learn about the location and the characters from the time period and the geographical area. They talk about that a little bit right there. Physical setting. This is where we start to think about day and night and seasons. If a story takes place in a specific season, if the author gives that to you, it's usually symbolic. When we think about spring, it's a time of renewal and youth. When we think about summer, it's a time of, you know, growth. Autumn is sort of like, you know, it's like a life cycle. Autumn is kind of like harvest and middle age, and then winter's death. So if the story starts off in the middle of winter, it's probably a signal to us. And so we can use those physical setting clues to help us start to understand some of the deeper elements of the story. One of the stories you're going to read for next week, Araby, takes place in the winter. And so does 56 to 0, right? And Snow, that Julia Alvarez piece. So when an author gives you that, sometimes you don't know what season it is, but if the author gives you a season, it's something to contemplate. Same thing, other physical settings. Is it in the woods? You know, those things give us what they call in this section atmosphere and mood. And they're pretty much the same thing, but it's what the description of the setting gives off to the characters and to us as readers. And it's something that we need to try to determine. So when we read something and we get, you know, a description that is spooky, it may give us feelings of, you know, reluctance or suspense. And all of that is done on purpose by the author. And so we consider that as part of the craft of literature, and we look at how the author is doing that. So that's why they're mentioning that here. They do mention, here's an important sentence if you didn't originally make notes about it, a story's atmosphere may also be linked to a character's mental state, reflecting their mood. So if a character is, you know, having a picnic in a sun-dappled valley on a blanket with their friends, that's probably going to indicate a happy type mood for the characters. So the setting can sometimes reflect the way that the author wants you to feel about the characters and their own moods. That's pretty much it for that chapter. They were both kind of some short chapters. They have the questions on here to help you analyze setting. Is there anything that you want me to go into some depth about from that reading assignment? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Crickets. Okay. All right. I want to introduce you to one of the assignments for this week, the characterization assignment. And if you open that assignment here, I think I have to share it separately. You'll see that there is a chart, and this one is due on Friday. I kind of want to see how you're doing with your in-depth thinking on characterization. So I want you to choose either 56 to 0, which is that football story that you read for today, or should I say not football story, because they suck horribly. they're they're horrible. And that's sort of the point of the story. Or Battle Royal by Ralph Ellison, either one of those for this week. And I want you to choose the protagonist from the story, whichever one you prefer. They're probably the narrator in both of them. Well, the third person, Ray Arthur, Larry Pete Fontenot, is probably the protagonist in 56 to 0, right? He drives the action in that story. And in Battle Royal, it's the narrator that is the protagonist. Either one. And you can see that on this chart, I've listed some character elements. There are 2 pages here, so make sure you get to the second page. Things like key physical qualities. What does the author give us about how this character looks? Well, Ray Arthur Larry Pete is a strong, burly, but damaged person physically. So this column right here is about just describing that as it's presented. You can list it out or whatever. So what are the key physical qualities? I put some little hints here, things to consider. What are some intangible qualities? Well, you know, I can look back at that character and say, what is his personality like? What are his motives? What are his flaws? Those things that you can't see. And I can list those in this column. What are the character's main conflicts, internal and external? What are some contradictions in the character's persona? Meaning, how do they embody opposites, right? Like you can be strong physically, but weak emotionally. So those two kind of conflict with each other. There's a contradiction there. What are some contradictions in the character's persona? How does the character interact with the setting is another thing that you can look at. And you're just putting your notes here, just a summary of that in this column. What is the nature of the character's growth? We talked about how the character's most likely dynamic, the protagonist. And so in what way does the character grow? And what could the character symbolize or be a metaphor for? And that will get us to like a deeper understanding of the character. So this column that says summary of element is just where you're sort of answering the question. You're putting in notes about each one of those things. And then this column, the third column, is where we take that to the next level. The next level is, okay, so what? Why does it matter that Ray Arthur Larry Pete Fontenot is a big buffalo of a guy and he's all damaged, if that's what I put here? Well, his life is damaged. And at the end of that story, we realize that he hasn't really got much of a life ahead of him, and he realizes it too because of his choices that he's made. So his big burliness and his clumsy quality and his damaged exterior really just mimics the quality of his life. He even has a vision, doesn't he, about his future children and his future wife, and it's not a pretty picture based on his decisions that he's made. So this is where I go, this column is where I go to the next level and say, okay, why does it matter that the author described the character in this way? Why does it matter that the character has these qualities? What's the point that the author's trying to get across by creating the character in that way? So when you're finished with filling this in, then you can upload it. There's an assignment on Blackboard. Some people have more success turning their Word documents into PDF. When they upload, I'll let you know if there's a problem with the upload, but you can upload the document and we'll see what happens. But sometimes on Blackboard, it's a smoother process if you turn your work into a PDF, but I'm not gonna make you do that. If I open it and I can't see it and it went, you know, haywire, then I'll let you know. Do you have any questions before I put you into some groups to get started on this assignment?
You said it was due Friday?
Yeah, this is due Friday. I want to give you an opportunity to, you know, start it today. I'm going to put you in some random groups, and then I'll pop into the groups and see if there are any questions over the readings for this week or the chart. And then you'll finish it up before Friday. Turn it in.
Is one person turning it in for the group or it's individual?
No, it's individual. And you don't have to choose the same character that your people in the group are choosing, but I just think maybe it'd be nice to start your assignment together and have a little conversation. I mean, it gets to be a lot just listening to your teachers jabber all the time, I think. I don't know. That's how I would feel if I was you. So it's just an opportunity. If you're in your group and you choose the character from 56 to 0 and somebody else in your group has Battle Royal, that's okay. You can just talk. You've all read the two stories, so you can kind of talk about it and get some ideas. You don't have to choose the same ones, but I just want you to get a head start on the assignment together. And then I can come into the rooms and see how you're doing, or if you have any questions, and then it should be pretty clear for you to finish before Friday on those. All right, I'll tell you what, I'm gonna put you into some random groups because I have to go back outside of the live meeting and make your groups for next time. So I will consider what you sent me on the chat for the next group. So it's gonna be random. Try to have a conversation about, these elements and work through your chart. Maybe a little bit of it you could get done. I'm gonna give you, about 25 minutes or so, 20 minutes in your group, and I'll pop in and see if you have any questions. So when it pops up on the screen, you can accept your group. Okay? All right. I did this last period, so now I'm semi-experienced at it.